Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And if you've been following along with us, we are still in First Corinthians, and today we're going to be in First Corinthians 7. And this is actually all of chapter 7, verses 1 through, I think it's 40. Looking through this, yeah, it's 1 through 40. But what we're going to do is we're going to split this because there's so much in this chapter, and there's so much to discuss that we're going to split this into two sections. So we're going to do part one today on marriage, and then we'll do part two tomorrow, looking at marriage and the things that Paul discusses here. And these are questions that the Corinthian church had about different things, and we'll see that as we go through this. So this one's one I think it's important, and we need to pay attention to, because there's a lot of, I think, misrepresentation of what the Bible says here in a lot of this stuff, and we'll hit on some of those things as we go through it. But as always, before I get started, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, ask that you do that. That way, you get we put these out daily. This is daily Bible study, daily Bible read. If you want to sign up for our notes, there's a link in the description of the video. You can do that and sign up, and then we email and text out the videos and also the notes and worksheets and stuff like that that we go through as well. But also, if you find this helpful, I ask that you share it so that way we can continue to spread this. And more than anything, I'm really appreciative of everyone who takes the time to watch these and spend your daily time in reading the Bible and studying the Bible with me. I really do appreciate that. I hope you're learning from it. I learn from it every time I go through it, and so hopefully we'll continue to learn and never stop. But so today we're looking at instructions on marriage, and this is, again, it can be a controversial topic. I'm going to hit these. Again, one of the ways I study the Bible, it's like I don't just cherry pick verses. I don't say, oh, well, I don't try to go and read just this section of scripture and be like, apply this to all things for all time. Now, there are some things that we do read and say, hey, this applies to all things to all time. But there's other things as we read this, right? We have to understand, like I talked about earlier, Paul is responding to a letter. He's responding to their questions. And so what is the context of this? Why are they asking these questions? And again, a lot of these apply to us as Christians, a lot, and Paul goes into a good detail on a lot of this. And so it's just important not to grab one verse in this whole section and try to just live off that. It's important to grab the whole thing as we go through it. So, like I said, today we're going to do 1 through 24. Tomorrow we'll do 25 through 40 and look at these things. And so I'm going to read these. I know this is a little bit longer, but I ask that you bear with me, because I think this is one of those that's really important that we go through together. And so I'm going to try to do that as we go through that. And so 1 Corinthians 7 verses 1 through 24, he says, now regarding the questions you asked in your letter. So this is a shift, and this is a shift in the notes, or in the going from the oral report to answering things that we're asking in the letter, and says, yes, it is good to abstain from sexual relations. But he says, that's a big but, because there is so much sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband. And so here's one of the things. And so what I'm going to try to do with this one is I'm going to try to pull from the notes as we go through. I think it's important to do that. This right here. So a lot of people have said that the Bible promotes polygamy, or that it doesn't really talk about polygamy in the New Testament. I think this answers that, right? When it says that each man should have his own wife and each woman should have her own husband, that kind of gets rid of the plurality in marriage, or plural marriages, or anything like that, or polygamy and things like that. It's 1 to 1, right? One wife to one husband, and this is what Paul is talking about this, and that's what Christ and God, when he first started creation, that's what he intended. Now, human beings, being who they are, messed that up. And so I think it's important that we hit this. And so, and I want you to understand that. So if anyone says, hey, the New Testament doesn't address polygamy, there it is. And I think that one will be pretty clear. And so verse 3, the husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. The wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. And that's that, this is that idea, right? That there's a mutuality in marriage, right? The husband isn't over the wife, and the wife isn't over the husband. It's a mutuality. So working together, right? The two become one, and it's the idea that it's one person, one group, one particular people working together. And now there are roles inside the marriage that we're going to look at later on, But again, they benefit each other. They work with each other. It's not the husband, like the husband's over here telling the wife what to do, and you have my authority and you belong to me. And a lot of times, I see this a lot in the church. They'll use like a half a verse. They'll be like, "Oh, look what verse 4 says. It says the wife gives authority over her body to her husband," and they'll be like, "Oh, well," and it's like they don't read the rest of the verse. They purposely do that, and that's what I mean by cherry picking stuff. This is a mutual relationship. This is working together. This is working together for the benefit of each other. And now, if in a sexual sense here, and even in a spiritual sense, the two belong to each other, right? And the two are to take care of each other's needs when it comes to this. And he talks about that because of sexual immorality. Because like because there is so much sexual immorality, y'all need to take care of this and take care of each other so that you're not tempted and to fall into something that you shouldn't. So verse 5, do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time, so you can give yourself more completely to prayer. So his idea here is like, don't, basically have sex a lot, is what he's saying. And don't, pull back from that unless you need to spend time in prayer. That's what he's saying. And it says here, it's something that you both agree upon. Like you both agree to. And again, the idea here is that we're all adults, and we all understand the fact that there is a lot of sexual temptation out in the world. Right? There's a lot of sexual immorality in the world, and the idea is if you're a partnership in this, and you take care of each other in these needs, then that's going to limit, and reduce the temptations for going outside the marriage and doing this stuff. And so that's the idea that Paul's talking about here. And so he says, afterwards, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so Paul's just telling it how it is, right? We know humans lack self-control. Right? Especially when it comes to sexuality, a lot of humans anyways. And so he's saying, look, don't allow yourself to fall into it or put yourself in an area and when it comes to this and where you are vulnerable to temptation because you're not taking care of each other's needs in this marriage. And so this is something that's really, really important. And I think sometimes we look over this. Sometimes, men use this in the wrong context to try to get what they want. And that's not what we're talking about here. This is a mutual thing. And it should be, okay, we're going to take care of each other's needs so that way neither one of us are tempted to go astray. Either, if sexually, emotionally, those type of things. Because if you're connected this way, you're going to be connected emotionally. You're going to be connected spiritually if you're doing this, obviously, in the right way. And so, he gives us these instructions for that reason. So in verse 6, he says, I say this as a concession, not as a command. All right, so this isn't a command to do this. You don't have to do this, but if you're going to, then you need to agree that, both of you need to agree that, hey, we're going to part for a little bit of time so we can either fast or do something like that. But this, it's not a command to do it, but he's saying, this is my advice if you're going to be doing this. He says, verse 7, I wish everyone were single just as I am. Right? Yet each person has a special gift from God in one kind or another. And one of the reasons he wishes everyone was single is because if they're single, you could, give more time to the Lord. But the other problem is if everyone was single, then the population would die out. So that wouldn't be as good as well. And so he goes on to say in verse 8, so I say to those who aren't married and to widows, it is better to stay unmarried, just as I am. But if they can't control themselves, then they should go ahead and marry. It's better to marry than to burn with lust. And so he's saying, hey, if you can live a single life without and not give into sexual things, then do it, And he's saying it's better to do that. It's better to stay unmarried. But if you can't, then it's better to marry, in which most people would fall under the latter. And so that's what the recommendation is there. And so, we all know Paul's bias is toward staying single, and he talks about that. But for those who are married, I have a command that comes not from me, but from the Lord. A wife must not leave her husband. Now, this is applying to Christians, the Christians that he's talking to here. And we'll look at this a little bit later. A wife must not leave her husband, but if she does leave him, let her remain single. And so this is one of the commands, right? If two Christians are married and they divorce, right, the idea is that they shouldn't. He says here, a wife must not, and so the same thing applies for a man must not leave her wife, right? So these two go into, but if she does leave him, let her remain single, or else be reconciled to him, and the husband must not leave his wife. And it's the same thing, right? If you're a Christian and you get divorced, then you should stay single. This is what Paul's saying. If both of you are Christians and you get a divorce, then both of you should stay single. Now, the idea is two Christians should stay together. And then if you can't, for whatever reason, then you should stay single, until either you can work that back out or some other things happen. Now we understand that there are some that God does or Christ does allow for certain circumstances of divorce, unfaithfulness being one of them, and we'll look at those later on in some of the other things that we read. But Paul's addressing certain questions that were asked to him here, and so that's what we're looking at. Now he says in verse 12, now I will the one. Let me go back one. I want to talk about this a little bit longer too. One of the things here is there is this thought in some sides of Christian that if you do, like if you are Christians and you divorce and you remarry, right, someone else, that like you're in this perpetual state of sin. And that's not the case, right? If you go back and look at, and I talked about this before, I did a thing on divorce. If you go back and look at the words of Christ, it is a one-off thing, right? When he talks about divorce and the sinfulness of divorce, it's not the Greek word that he uses. He could have used an ongoing format of that, and so it's not you're not in this perpetual state of sin like the entire time. Like you're not in this perpetual state of an affair if that does happen, right? But it's not something that's encouraged, and so that's the thing. It's something you can be forgiven for. Right? It's something you can do and be okay in the end, right? Asking for forgiveness. Now, if your intentions is, oh, I can do this and I'll be forgiven, that's very dangerous territory, and I wouldn't go there. We see what Paul says here, right? Two Christians should stay together, and they should do their best to stay together no matter what, right? But I want to throw that in there because there's been some what I would call wrong teachings around that. If you look at the Greek words and the way that Jesus presented it, it wasn't, oh, well, if you do this, you're committing adultery and it's an ongoing act of adultery. No, the way he uses it in the term, the Greek term that he uses it, it's in a singular form. It's not. It's like that at that time, but it's not an ongoing thing. And I hope that makes sense. And if you have any questions, have any thoughts around that, leave it in the comments or shoot me some messages and we can discuss it. But I want people to understand that, like, you're not in this ongoing state of an affair if that does happen. Again, I don't encourage it. I'm not saying it's okay to do. What I'm saying is you can be forgiven for it, but it's highly encouraged, especially as Christians, not to get into not to divorce at all. Do everything you can in your power to work things out. Now, there's sometimes it can't, and I understand that. There's things that happen, and I understand that. But we're given very few reasons where Christians are allowed to get divorced, and unfaithfulness is one of them. Abandonment is another one, and so we're gonna look at some of those later on. All right, so sorry, sidetrack there. Verse 12. Now I will speak to the rest of you, though I do not have a direct command from the Lord. If a fellow believer has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to continue to live with him, he must not leave her. And if a believing woman has a husband who is not a believer and is willing to continue living with her, she must not leave him. For the believing wife brings holiness to her marriage, and the believing husband brings holiness to his marriage. Otherwise, your children will not be holy, but now they are holy. And so the whole idea here, and he kind of goes into this idea of basically whatever whatever you come into, because a lot of these would have been people who become Christians, but their spouse didn't become Christian. And so the idea here is stay in the marriage, right? As long as they want to continue living on. And we're going to look at the next section about what that says. He's like, so basically, whatever state you were in when you got married, stay there. And we're going to see this, he applies this into some other things as well. Like, don't go and be like, oh, well, my husband's not a Christian, so I'm going to get a divorce now. No, because there's a possibility, and Paul addresses this, that you might be able to convert this person and bring them to Christ by staying married to him. So the right thing to do is to say, and the other side of this is, it's a good example for your children, right? It says, otherwise your children would not be holy, but now they're holy. And the idea here is you staying in the marriage doesn't make your children holy, but it helps lead them, and you show them an example, right? We all know that it would have been the same way back then, that families and households that are together are much more likely to produce well-mannered, behaved, well-functioning adults in society. And so we know that. And so that's what his encouragement there is, to say, look, if you're married to a non-believer, whether you're male or female, stay married to that person. And, because it's going to bring holiness to the marriage, to the children. It's a good example, right? And you can then possibly be able to convert that person. So he goes on to say here, but if the husband or wife who isn't a believer insists on leaving, let them go. In such cases, the believing husband or wife is no longer bound to the other, for God has called you to live in peace. And so, what he's saying here is that if the unbeliever wants to leave, then they're leave. You're not guilty of anything here, right? That is up to him or her. And so, and then at that point, you're free to do whatever you want. You're free to remarry. You're free to, there's no bond, there's no covenant between you and God with this person, or between the marriage and God, between an unbeliever and a believer. And so he says, don't you wives realize at the end, don't you wives realize that your husband might be saved because of you? So, and don't you husbands realize that your wives might be saved because, and that's why he's saying, stay with them, because you might be able, by staying with them and being a good example in the marriage, then you can continue and maybe bring them to Christ. And that's the whole idea there. And then so stay in it. But he says, if they leave, whoever, the male, the husband or the wife, if they want to leave, then let them leave, and you're not bound. And so that's what he's saying there. There's nothing that calls you to stay single after that you can't remarry after that, because the husband or wife of the non-believer is choosing to leave in that sense. So nothing that you're bound to there. Verse 17, each of you should continue to live in whatever situation the Lord has placed you, and remain as you were when God first called you. This is my rule for all the churches. And so again, right, he's saying whatever, because I think there was this idea that, oh, well, because I'm a Christian or because I'm this, then I need I got to do this, or I got to undo this. And he gives some examples, right? For instance, a man who was circumcised before he became a believer should not try to reverse it. Please don't do that. All right. And the man who was uncircumcised when he became a believer should not be circumcised now, for it makes no difference whether or not a man has been circumcised. The important thing is to keep God's commandments. And so what he's saying, there were some who were like, oh, I was circumcised, I'm no longer, and so I'm going to go back into, I'm trying to shed off the Jewish, those type of things that the Jewish customs, and trying to go back into it. Or there were some who were like, oh, well, especially like the Greeks and the stuff like that, the Gentiles who were coming in and were being around a lot of Jewish people who had been circumcised. Oh, it's like, oh, I need to be circumcised. And there were some, we've already talked about that, where some Jews were telling them they had to. And he's like, no, you don't, whatever situation you're in, whatever you're in, as long as it's not a sinful situation, this is obviously what he's talking about, you need to remain in it, right? So what he's saying is, if you're married or to a non-Christian, remain in that marriage. Right? If you're not circumcised, don't get circumcised. Right? If you are circumcised, don't try to undo it. Those things don't matter. What you need to focus on is the important things of keeping God's commandments. And so he moves on. Yes, each of you should remain as you were when God called you. Are you a slave? Don't let that worry you, right? And we need to understand, and I've talked about this before, when the term slave comes up in the New Testament, it's not the slavery that we think of in America. Right, it's not that type of slavery. It was what's called a bond servant. Typically, it was someone who was basically indebted to someone, and so they were trying to work that off, and so they worked for them, right? And they until they were free. They basically kind of belonged to them, but it wasn't the same sense of slavery as we see in America today. I know a lot of people get that confused. So I want you to understand that. And that's why Paul's going to talk about this here in a minute. He says, don't let that worry you, but if you get a chance to be free, take it. He's not saying, he's like, okay, if you're a servant, right, and you're trying to work off something, or you're doing this and you're serving someone, as soon as you get that chance to be free, take it. Don't stay in that. And he's not saying that. He's like, but he says, and remember, if you were a slave when the Lord called you, you are now free in the Lord. And so he's saying, like, you're free. No, let me finish this. I'm sorry. And if you're free when the Lord called you, you are now a slave of Christ. And so that's he kind of uses that. It's like, look, those who are slaves, those who are bondservants to someone, right, you may have to be working this. You may kind of belong to this person right now until you can work this debt off. But remember that you're free in Christ, right? So don't let that hinder you. Don't let that, like, because there was obviously a shamefulness that went on with that, because a lot of times it was you didn't pay off money you were supposed to, or a lot of different things like that, or you were indebted for whatever reason, and so there could be shame around that. But then he reminds those who are free, right, so they don't brag, that hey, now you are a slave to Christ. You belong to Christ now. You're a servant of Christ, so don't get a haughty attitude of that. God paid a high price for you, so don't be enslaved by this world. Each of you, dear brothers and sisters, should remain as you were when God first called you. And so he uses this, like I said, I know there's a lot in this. He uses all these verses and these questions around what's going on here to answer a lot of their questions. And I want you to remember the context that they're in. Is that they were dealing with sexual. We looked at sexual immorality, right? A sexual sin yesterday, right? And he talks about avoiding that. And there's a reason why he goes avoiding the sexual sin, and then starts to talk about marriage and how, because we see that at the beginning of, if you can avoid being in sexual sin, then get married, right? Because that's what God designed marriage for, is sex within the marriage, and have fun with that is what he's saying, basically, And so those are the things that then he talks about the divorce, because there were questions about divorce and should they be a divorce. And he's saying, look, among Christians, no, don't divorce, right? And if you do, you need to stay single. Now, like I said, there are things around that where divorce is allowed among Christians and remarriage is allowed, and those type of things, and we'll talk about those more as we hit them. But mostly, it's abandonment. I would sexual immorality, right, or unfaithfulness in the marriage. I'd also put on there that if the person is no longer Christian, right? If you're a Christian in the marriage and the person leaves the Lord, then I think again the instruction is to stay. But if he wants to leave, right, then there's unfaithfulness there anyways. And so if the person leaves Christianity and stuff, there's an unfaithfulness factors to that, I believe, as well. And so there's some abandonment things and stuff like that. And so those are the main issues that we look at there. And so then he reminds them, like, remain what you are. Be, if you're this when you become a Christian, stay in that. Right now, he's not talking about sinful situations. Right? If you're in a sinful situation, then you need to get out of that. And we're going to talk about some of those. And so whenever you become a Christian, people have used these verses to say, hey, oh, well, see, he tells us to stay as we are. It's like, no. He's talking about in these situations where you're not living a sinful lifestyle. Any sinful lifestyle that you're living, then you are to get out of immediately, right? Or at least work to get out of. And sometimes those things are a little bit harder, and we need to have an understanding there. And so I hope this makes sense. And like I said, if you got any questions, I know we covered a lot. There could be probably 3 or 4 lessons really in this whole thing. I could really slice this up and go through it, but I try to do these 10, 15, 20 minutes. We're at 22 minutes here. But I think this is an important topic because there's a lot of things that have gotten twisted with this. There's a lot of things that people have taken it too far, either to the left or too far to the right, made it way too conservative, made way too restrictive than beyond the teachings of the Bible. And then there's others who have opened this up to like, oh well, you can just do whatever you want, and that's not the case. There's instructions for Christians who are married, and there's instructions for Christians who are married to non-Christians. And so we need to make sure that we don't blur those lines and we understand what those say. And then there's that reminder of, remain where you are. Like I said, as long as it's not in a sinful situation, remain in your, be as good of an influence as you can, whether you're married to a non-Christian. In this example, he uses as someone, being a slave or a bond servant. But I mean, it could be in our jobs. It could be anything. He's like, look, don't make these drastic changes like immediately and do this stuff, but remain where you are and be a good Christian influence wherever you are, especially in marriage. And that's one of the things that he talks about here. So we'll continue on tomorrow into part 2 of instructions to marriage, and now he's going to turn here to those eligible for marriage, and thus discusses the advisability of marriage and distress and those type things here. Talks about and basically gives instructions to those who are about to get married. And so again, I appreciate everyone who takes time. Like I said, if you had any questions, you got any comments, or you disagree, as long as you disagree in a Christ-like manner, well, I'll have conversations. I appreciate it. I'm always insightful to things. I'm always trying to learn more as we dive deeper into these type of things. But if you have questions, if you have thoughts, shoot them, put them in the comments, send us messages. I would appreciate it. But more than anything, appreciate those who take the time to watch, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.